In the heart of the Mongol Empire, during the height of its power, there lived a princess who defeated over 10,000 men in hand-to-hand combat. Not in legend, not in myth, in documented historical reality. Her name was Khutulun, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself. While European princesses were being locked in towers and married off for political alliances, this warrior woman was leading cavalry charges, dictating military strategy to generals twice her age, and accumulating a herd of 10,000 horses won from suitors who dared challenge her to wrestling matches. Marco Polo himself wrote about her, calling her the most magnificent woman he had ever encountered. But here's what they don't want you to know. Despite being one of the most accomplished military commanders of her age, despite being chosen by her father to succeed him as Khan, Khutulun's story was systematically erased from history. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why her legacy terrified the historians who came after her. Our story begins in the year 1260, in the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. Picture this vast expanse of grassland, dotted with thousands of felt tents, where the thunder of hooves was the soundtrack of daily life and the scent of fermented mare's milk hung in the air. This was a world where strength determined status, where both men and women learned to ride before they could walk, and where the descendants of Genghis Khan ruled over the largest contiguous empire in human history. Into this world, Khutulun was born as the daughter of Kaidu, one of the most powerful Mongol princes of the 13th century. Kaidu himself was the grandson of Urjadeh Khan, who had been the third son of Genghis Khan and the empire's second great Khan. This bloodline wasn't just prestigious. It was sacred. The Mongols believed that Genghis Khan's descendants carried the mandate of heaven itself, a divine right to rule that flowed through their veins like liquid fire. But here's what made Khutulun's childhood different from every other Mongol princess before her. While most noble daughters were being prepared for diplomatic marriages and household management, Kaidu raised Khutulun alongside her 14 brothers as a warrior. Imagine a girl of 7 years old, barely tall enough to reach a horse's stirrup, being taught to shoot a bow from horseback at full gallop. Picture her small hands gripping a wooden practice sword, her father correcting her stance, teaching her the same techniques he taught his sons. The Mongol Empire at this time was fracturing along fault lines that Genghis Khan himself had inadvertently created. The great Khan's decision to divide his empire among his sons had planted the seeds of inevitable conflict. By the time Khutulun was born, the empire had split into 4 major khanates, each ruled by different branches of the family, each hungry for more power, each viewing the others with increasing suspicion. Kaidu, Khutulun's father, found himself in direct opposition to the most powerful man in the Mongol world. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis through a different line, had declared himself Great Khan and was in the process of conquering China, establishing what would become the Yuan dynasty. But Kaidu refused to acknowledge Kublai's supremacy. He believed that Kublai had become too Chinese, too soft, too corrupted by the sedentary lifestyle of the civilizations they had conquered. What Kaidu envisioned was a return to the old ways, to the pure Mongol traditions of the steppes, where power came from the strength of your arm and the loyalty of your warriors, not from sitting on a throne in a palace. This philosophical divide would plunge Central Asia into decades of war, and Khutulun would grow up not in peacetime luxury, but on battlefields. Contemporary accounts describe how, by the age of 14, Khutulun had already participated in her first military campaigns. But she wasn't merely present as a symbolic figurehead or a protected observer. She fought. Chronicles from the period tell of a young woman who could ride alongside the most seasoned cavalry warriors, who could draw a bow with such force that her arrows could pierce armor, who demonstrated such skill in wrestling that grown men refused to face her in practice matches. The Mongol military system was perhaps the most sophisticated fighting force the medieval world had ever seen. Warriors were organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, with each level of commander responsible for the men below them. They used advanced tactics including feigned retreats, pincer movements, and psychological warfare. Their composite bows, made from horn, wood, and sinew, could shoot arrows over 300 meters with deadly accuracy. Their horses, small but incredibly hardy, could survive on minimal forage and travel vast distances without tiring. Khutulun mastered all of it, but here's the fascinating part. She didn't just become competent, she became exceptional. By her late teens, Khutulun had earned a reputation that spread across the steppes. Kaidu began relying on her not just as a warrior, but as a military advisor. When planning campaigns against Kublai Khan's forces, it was Khutulun who sat in the war councils, Khutulun whose tactical assessments Kaidu trusted above those of his seasoned generals. What Khutulun created wasn't just a military career, it was a complete reimagining of what a Mongol woman could be. The steppes had always afforded women more freedom than their counterparts in sedentary civilizations. Mongol women could own property, divorce their husbands, and participate in tribal councils. But Khutulun took this to an entirely new level. She commanded men in battle. She was present at sieges. She led cavalry charges that broke enemy formations. The historical sources paint a picture of a woman who was physically imposing by the standards of her time. One chronicler described her as being able to ride into enemy ranks, seize a captive warrior as easily as a hawk snatches a chicken, and return with him to her father's side. Whether this was literal truth or poetic exaggeration, it spoke to a reputation for physical prowess that was extraordinary. But as Khutulun's reputation as a warrior grew, so did pressure from an unexpected direction: her own family. This brings us to the pivotal moment and the decision that would define the most famous aspect of Khutulun's legend. By her early 20s, Khutulun remained unmarried. In Mongol society, this was becoming increasingly unusual, especially for a woman of royal blood. Political marriages were the currency of diplomacy, and Kaidu's advisors repeatedly pressed him to arrange a match for his daughter. Her brothers, particularly, began to grumble. They saw their sister's unmarried state as a source of gossip and speculation. They worried it reflected poorly on the family. They suggested, with increasing insistence, that it was time for Khutulun to settle down and fulfill what they considered her proper role. But Khutulun had no interest in a traditional arranged marriage. She had seen too many capable women relegated to domestic obscurity, their potential wasted in the management of households when they could have been leading armies. She had tasted freedom, authority, and the intoxicating rush of military command. She was not about to surrender that for any man, regardless of his lineage or political connections. So she made Kaidu an offer that would become legendary across the Mongol world. She would marry, she said, but only to a man who could defeat her in wrestling. And any man who challenged her and lost would forfeit 100 horses to her herd. The year was approximately 1280 when Khutulun's challenge became widely known. Wrestling was not merely a sport in Mongol culture. It was a sacred tradition, a test of strength and skill that determined status and honor. For a woman to challenge men to wrestling matches was already unconventional. For her to demand such a high stake made it irresistible. The suitors came from across the Mongol territories. Princes, warriors, nobles, and commoners, each confident in his strength, each certain that a woman, no matter how skilled, could not possibly defeat a man in a contest of pure physical power. One by one, they faced Khutulun. One by one, they fell. Contemporary accounts from Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who chronicled the Mongol Empire, describe how these matches became spectacles. Crowds would gather to watch as yet another confident warrior stepped onto the wrestling ground, and Khutulun, with technique perfected over years of training, would use leverage, timing, and skill to defeat opponents who often outweighed her significantly. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. Khutulun didn't just defeat a few suitors, she defeated all of them, every single one, and with each victory her herd of horses grew, 100 horses here, 100 there. The numbers accumulated like a scoreboard of shattered male egos. By the time her challenge had run its course, Khutulun had amassed a herd of 10,000 horses. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, you need to grasp what 10,000 horses meant in the Mongol world. Horses were wealth, horses were power. Horses were the foundation of military might. 10,000 horses represented a fortune equivalent to millions of dollars in modern currency. It was the kind of wealth that could fund armies, forge political alliances, and establish dynasties. And Khutulun had won it all herself, through her own skill and strength, defeating men who had come from every corner of the empire to challenge her. Marco Polo himself recorded Khutulun's story during his travels through the Mongol Empire. In his famous chronicles, he wrote of a princess so strong and brave that she would ride into enemy ranks during battle, snatch a prisoner as easily as a hawk seizes its prey, and bring him back to her father. He described her as refusing all marriage proposals unless the suitor could defeat her in wrestling, and noted the enormous herd of horses she had accumulated from unsuccessful challengers. This wasn't legend being recorded centuries later by mythmakers looking to embellish history. This was a contemporary account from one of the most famous travelers of the medieval period, a man who spent 17 years in service to Kublai Khan and witnessed the Mongol world at its height. Marco Polo's account provides crucial historical validation. Khutulun was real, her achievements were real. And her story was remarkable enough that it captured the attention of observers from halfway around the world. But the wrestling challenge, as famous as it became, was only one aspect of Khutulun's life. While she was defeating suitors and accumulating horses, she was also fighting wars. The conflict between Kaidu and Kublai Khan dominated Central Asian politics for over 3 decades. These weren't minor skirmishes. These were massive military campaigns involving tens of thousands of warriors, sophisticated siege warfare, and battles that determined the fate of entire regions. Kaidu controlled a vast territory in Central Asia, including parts of modern-day Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Western Mongolia. His power base was built on traditional Mongol military strength and the loyalty of warriors who shared his vision of preserving nomadic culture against what they saw as Kublai's corrupting Chinese influence. Khutulun was Kaidu's most trusted military commander, not one of his most trusted, the most trusted. Historical sources indicate that Kaidu valued her counsel above that of his sons, above that of his generals, above that of his advisors. When planning campaigns, it was Khutulun who often devised the strategy. When leading attacks, it was Khutulun who Kaidu wanted by his side. This created an extraordinary situation. Here was a woman in her 20s and 30s wielding military authority in one of the most male-dominated warrior cultures in human history, and she was doing it successfully. Kaidu's forces won significant victories against Kublai Khan's armies. They captured territory, defeated expeditions, and maintained independence for decades against the world's most powerful empire. Imagine standing on a hillside overlooking a battlefield in 13th century Central Asia. Below you, thousands of mounted warriors arrange themselves in precise formations. Dust rises from the trampling of hooves. The air smells of horse sweat leather, and the metallic tang of weapons being sharpened. And there, among the commanders directing this controlled chaos, is a woman whose tactical decisions will determine whether thousands of men live or die in the coming hours. This was Khutulun's reality, not occasionally, regularly, for years, but as Khutulun's influence grew, so did resentment among certain factions of Kaidu's court. Her brothers, in particular, viewed her prominence with increasing alarm. In Mongol succession traditions, leadership typically passed from father to son. But Kaidu was making increasingly clear that he viewed Khutulun, not her brothers, as his worthiest successor. Here's where the story becomes almost tragic in its inevitability. Kaidu recognized what many in his time could not, that merit, skill, and capability had nothing to do with gender. That his daughter possessed qualities of leadership, courage, and strategic thinking that surpassed those of his sons. That if he truly wanted what was best for his Khanate, if he wanted to ensure its continued strength and independence after his death, the logical choice was to name Khutulun as his heir. But this decision, rational as it was, violated deeply entrenched expectations. Even in Mongol society, which afforded women more rights than many other cultures, the idea of a woman ruling as Khan was revolutionary. It had never been done. There was no precedent. And Kaidu's sons saw their father's preference for their sister as a profound humiliation and a threat to their own ambitions. The historical record suggests that Khutulun's brothers began spreading rumors. They questioned her unmarried state in increasingly pointed terms. They suggested that her relationship with her father was somehow improper, planting seeds of innuendo designed to undermine her reputation. They created factions within the court, gathering supporters who shared their view that tradition demanded a male heir. The pressure became enormous, not just on Khutulun, but on Kaidu himself. His advisors warned him that naming a female successor could fracture his coalition. could give Kublai Khan an opportunity to exploit divisions within his realm, could undo everything he had fought to build. And here's the part that most histories gloss over, but which represents the real tragedy of Khutulun's story. Eventually, she compromised. Sometime in the late 1280s, Khutulun married a man named Ghazan. The historical sources are frustratingly vague about the details. We don't know if she ever wrestled him, whether he defeated her, or whether she chose to set aside her challenge. What we do know is that the marriage happened, and it happened under circumstances that suggest it was driven more by political pressure than personal desire. This wasn't a defeat in battle. This wasn't a failure of strength or courage. This was something more insidious. It was the slow grinding weight of social expectation, the accumulated pressure from family, court, and tradition that even the strongest warrior princess could not entirely resist. But even married, Khutulun did not retire to domestic life. She continued to fight. She continued to advise her father. She continued to command warriors in battle. If her brothers and the court traditionalists thought that marriage would domesticate her, would transform her into a conventional royal wife concerned primarily with household management and producing heirs, they were wrong. Contemporary chroniclers continued to record her presence at military campaigns throughout the 1290s. She remained Kaidu's chief advisor. And her father, despite the political pressure, never fully abandoned his desire to see her succeed him. But fate had other plans. In 1301, during a military campaign, Kaidu was wounded in battle. The injury, while not immediately fatal, was serious enough that he was forced to withdraw from active campaigning. His health declined over the following months, and as it became clear that the great Khan of Central Asia was dying, the question of succession became urgent. Kaidu, even on his deathbed, advocated for Khutulun. The historical sources record that he explicitly told his sons and commanders that his daughter should rule after him, that she possessed the wisdom, courage, and capability to lead their people, that she had earned the right through years of service and demonstrated competence. But when Kaidu died in 1301, his sons ignored his wishes. They could not accept a woman as Khan. They could not overcome their own ambitions, their own jealousies, their own adherence to tradition. Instead, Kaidu's son Chapar was proclaimed Khan. Khutulun could have contested this. She had the loyalty of many warriors. She had proven herself in battle time and time again. She had a legitimate claim based on her father's expressed wishes, but the historical record suggests she chose not to plunge her people into civil war. She accepted the decision, perhaps believing that unity was more important than her own ambitions, perhaps simply recognizing that the forces arrayed against her were too powerful to overcome without tearing apart everything her father had built. So she did something remarkable. She continued to serve. Under her brother's rule, Khutulun remained a military commander. She continued to lead campaigns. She continued to defend the territories her father had held against Kublai Khan's forces. But here's where the story enters its final, most mysterious chapter. Less than 2 years after Kaidu's death, in 1306 or 1307, the historical sources record that Khutulun herself died. The circumstances are frustratingly unclear. Some sources suggest she died in battle. Others hint at assassination. Still others mention illness. What's most striking is what happened next. Or rather, what didn't happen. When Kublai Khan died in 1294, his death was recorded in elaborate detail by multiple chroniclers. Monuments were erected. His achievements were catalogued extensively. His legacy was carefully preserved. When Kaidu died in 1301, similar efforts were made to document his life and significance. But when Khutulun died, there was near silence. No elaborate death chronicles, no detailed accounts of her final days. No monuments erected to commemorate the warrior princess who had defeated 10,000 men, who had commanded armies, who had shaped the military and political landscape of Central Asia for over 3 decades. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire was becoming increasingly influenced by the sedentary civilizations it had conquered. Chinese bureaucratic traditions were taking hold in the eastern parts of the empire. Islamic cultural norms were shaping the Western territories. And both of these traditions had very specific ideas about the proper role of women, ideas that did not include women commanding armies, ideas that did not include women refusing marriage until they found a man who could defeat them in combat. Ideas that did not include women being chosen by their fathers to rule over men. Khutulun's story, her very existence, was an uncomfortable truth for the historians and chroniclers who came after her. She didn't fit the narratives they wanted to tell. She complicated the clean story of male warriors and male leaders. She raised questions about women's capabilities that the increasingly patriarchal societies of the 14th and 15th centuries did not want to confront, so they erased her, not completely. Marco Polo's account survived, providing a thread of evidence that could not be entirely eliminated. Rashid al-Din's Persian chronicles preserved some details, but in Chinese historical sources, which became the dominant narratives of Yuan dynasty history, Khutulun was reduced to a footnote or ignored entirely. Her military achievements were downplayed. Her role as advisor and commander was minimized. Her father's desire to make her his successor was either omitted or presented as a temporary aberration, a moment of poor judgment rather than a recognition of genuine merit. For over 6 centuries, Khutulun existed primarily as a footnote in Marco Polo's travels, a curious anecdote about a wrestling princess, interesting but dismissed by many scholars as likely exaggeration or fantasy. The full scope of her military and political significance remained buried in fragmentary Persian sources that few Western historians bothered to examine closely. This wasn't just about one woman being forgotten. It was about the systematic erasure of evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and capability. Because if Khutulun could command armies, if she could defeat thousands of men in combat, if she could be recognized by her own father as his worthiest successor, then what did that say about all the women throughout history who were never given such opportunities? What did it say about the societies that restricted women to domestic spheres, that insisted they were inherently unsuited for leadership or warfare? These were questions that the historians who shaped our understanding of the past did not want to confront. So they buried Khutulun just as surely as if they had erased her from every record entirely. But here's the fascinating part. They couldn't erase her completely. The fragments remained. Marco Polo's account was too famous to suppress. Rashid al-Din's chronicles survived in enough copies that the evidence could not be entirely eliminated. And in the 20th century, as historians began to re-examine Mongol sources with fresh eyes, as women historians started asking different questions and looking for different stories, Khutulun began to emerge from the shadows. For over 6 centuries, the warrior princess who defeated 10,000 men, who commanded armies and shaped the fate of empires, was essentially erased from mainstream historical consciousness. Her story survived in fragments, in footnotes, in sources that were ignored or dismissed by the predominantly male historians who shaped our understanding of the Mongol Empire. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that serious scholarly attention began to recover Khutulun's full story. Researchers examining Persian language sources discovered extensive documentation of her military career. Historians specializing in women's history began piecing together evidence that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Archaeologists working in Central Asia found evidence corroborating the scale and significance of Kaidu's campaigns in which Khutulun played a central role. Today, as we recover and rediscover these stories, we're not just learning about one remarkable woman. We're being forced to confront how many other stories have been lost, how many other exceptional individuals have been erased from history because they didn't fit comfortable narratives, because they challenged assumptions about what people of their gender, class, or background were supposed to be capable of achieving. Khutulun's legacy forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How many other warrior women existed throughout history whose stories were deliberately suppressed? How many women demonstrated leadership, courage, and capability in fields traditionally reserved for men, only to be written out of the historical record by chroniclers uncomfortable with evidence that contradicted their worldviews? The Mongol Empire produced many extraordinary individuals. Genghis Khan himself is remembered as one of history's greatest conquerors. Kublai Khan is famous for establishing the Yuan dynasty and hosting Marco Polo. Their achievements were preserved, studied, and remembered across centuries. But Khutulun, who demonstrated equal courage, capability, and historical significance, was nearly lost to history entirely. The difference wasn't in her achievements. The difference was in how uncomfortable those achievements made the men who recorded history. Today, Khutulun's story is experiencing a renaissance. She has been featured in documentaries, books, and even popular television series, but this renewed attention is very recent. It's only in the last few decades that her story has begun to reach a broader audience, that the full scope of her significance has been recognized and celebrated. Khutulun reminds us that the history we think we know is often incomplete. That the stories we've been told about what people in the past were like, what they were capable of, what roles they played, are often filtered through biases and assumptions that distorted reality. That every generation of historians brings their own prejudices to the examination of evidence, seeing some stories clearly while being blind to others. The wrestling princess who accumulated 10,000 horses wasn't a myth. The military commander who shaped the campaigns of Central Asian wars wasn't a legend. The woman who her father chose as his worthiest successor wasn't a fantasy. She was real. Her achievements were real. And the fact that she was nearly erased from history tells us as much about the societies that came after her as it does about her own remarkable life. Khutulun's legacy endures in every question we ask about historical narratives, in every overlooked source we examine with fresh eyes, in every effort to recover the voices that powerful institutions tried to silence. She stands as proof that greatness can emerge anywhere, achieve anything, regardless of what conventional wisdom says is possible. But her near erasure also reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements can be lost if we don't actively work to preserve them, if we don't question the stories we've been told, if we don't demand a fuller and more honest accounting of the past. The truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it. And sometimes, you have to be willing to challenge centuries of assumptions about whose stories matter, whose achievements deserve to be remembered, and whose legacies deserve to endure. If this story opened your eyes to how much of history remains hidden or deliberately obscured, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the extraordinary individuals who shaped our world, but were written out of the stories we were taught. Let me know in the comments what other forgotten warriors, leaders, or revolutionaries you think deserve to have their stories recovered and told. Because for every Khutulun we manage to rediscover, there are countless others still waiting in the fragments of historical sources, waiting for someone to piece together their remarkable lives and give them the recognition they earned centuries ago. The past is not fixed. It's constantly being rewritten as we ask better questions and look more carefully at evidence that previous generations ignored, and that process of rediscovery is just beginning.